Oregon says it has a budget problem. Roads are falling apart. ODOT has been staring down a nearly $300 million transportation shortfall. State agencies are being told to find savings. Lawmakers are warning about service cuts, hiring freezes, and painful budget decisions. But apparently, Oregon still has money for conferences about creative resistance. Taxpayer-supported queer data projects, equity offices, and bureaucratic training pipelines that somehow always survive the cuts. Funny how that works. When the budget is tight, the roads get cut, maintenance gets cut, public safety gets squeezed, but the ideological machinery, that thing gets a protected lane.
From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth.
Welcome to Left Coast News. Today we are looking at Oregon's fiscal priorities, and this one is a perfect example of modern government logic. The state says it is under financial stress. Oregon lawmakers had to rebalance the 2025 to 27 budget after federal tax changes blew a major hole in revenue projections. ODOT separately faced a major maintenance and operations shortfall, with the agency warning about service cuts after lawmakers passed a short-term fix. At the same time, Oregon taxpayers are watching money flow into equity offices, cultural competency programming, state-backed LGBTQ research projects, and conferences with themes like creative resistance, community power through community care. And the question is simple. When government claims it cannot afford basic services, why does it always seem to afford ideology? Let's start with the conference. The Meaningful Care Conference 2026 was centered around LGBTQ healthcare, social services, cultural competency, and community care. The theme, according to the materials being circulated, was creative resistance, community power through community care. Now, nobody is saying private groups can't hold conferences. This is America. People can gather, speak, organize, perform poetry, discuss healthcare, and build community. That is not the issue. The issue is taxpayer involvement. Because when public agencies participate, sponsor, send staff, pay registration fees, fund related programs, or support outside organizations, then the public has every right to ask what the money is buying, especially when the same government says the cupboard is bare. That brings us to the Pride in Numbers project. Pride in Numbers describes itself as a statewide Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ research project in Oregon, using surveys, storytelling sessions, interviews, and a community art project. The project says it is funded by a mix of foundation grants and state dollars. Supporters will say this is about identifying health disparities and improving public services. But critics are going to ask the obvious question. Why is a state facing budget stress spending taxpayer dollars on community-led ideological research while core services are being cut, delayed, or patched together? Because this is always the trick. They say it is only $1.25 million. They say it is tiny compared to the whole budget. They say it is just a drop in the bucket. But taxpayers are tired of hearing that. $1 million here, a conference there, a training office here, a grant program there, a consultant contract over there. Pretty soon, the bucket is not leaking, it is being drained with a fire hose. And every dollar spent on political fashion is a dollar not spent on roads, public safety, foster care, emergency services, bridges, wildfire readiness, mental health beds, or keeping violent offenders away from the public. Then there's ODOT. The Oregon Department of Transportation faced a major budget shortfall for maintenance and operations. ODOT said the legislature's 2026 funding package addressed a $297 million shortfall and helped avoid deep layoffs and service cuts. That matters because transportation is not optional. Roads are not a luxury. Bridges are not a special interest group. Snowplows, maintenance crews, DMV services, highway safety, and basic infrastructure are core government responsibilities. This is what taxpayers think they are paying for. But while ODOT is warning about maintenance problems, the state also maintains an Office of Equity and Civil Rights tied to compliance, contracting requirements, equity programs, and internal agency initiatives. According to the 2025-27 legislatively adopted budget and recent legislative reports from May 2026, the specific funding for this division is approximately $24.9 million for the biennium. Now, some of that may be legally required under federal civil rights law. Fine, follow the law. But here is the accountability question. How much of this is actual legal compliance and how much is ideological expansion wearing a compliance costume? Because taxpayers deserve a line-by-line answer. If the office is handling Title VI compliance and federal contract requirements, show the public the costs. If it is funding trainings, conferences, travel, equity consultants, cultural programming, and outside partnerships, show the public that too. No hiding behind vague phrases like community-centered engagement or culturally responsive infrastructure. That language is where accountability goes to die. And then there is the Oregon kicker. Oregon is returning $1.41 billion kicker credit to taxpayers on 2025 tax returns because previous cycle revenue came in above the constitutional threshold. The kicker exists because Oregon law requires surplus revenue to be returned when collections exceed forecasts by more than 2%. That is important because it creates a strange picture. On one hand, taxpayers are getting money back from the previous budget cycle. On the other hand, the current budget is under pressure. So Oregon is saying we had enough excess revenue to trigger a massive refund, but now we're short and agencies need cuts and transportation needs help. And somehow the solution is never to question the ideological spending machine. That is the issue, not whether a conference can exist, not whether a private organization can do research, not whether people have the right to advocate for their community. They absolutely do. The issue is whether taxpayers should be forced to fund political priorities when the state claims it cannot afford basic government functions. Because government has a constitutional duty to serve the public, not to act like a grant-writing department for activist nonprofits. And this is where Oregon voters should demand answers. How much taxpayer money went into the Meaningful Care Conference? How many state employees attended? Which agencies paid registration fees? Were travel costs reimbursed? Were public employees attending during paid work hours? Were any payments routed through interagency agreements? Were third-party nonprofits funded through grants or subgrants? And most importantly, who approved this spending while agencies were being told to cut costs? That is the story. Not the rainbow branding, not the polished conference language, not the bureaucratic buzzwords. The story is priorities. When roads are short on funding, when school districts are cutting positions, when agencies are warning about deficits, and when families are getting crushed by the cost of living, government does not get to say, trust us. No. In a constitutional republic, the government answers to the people, not the other way around. Oregon's budget problem is not just a math problem, it's a values problem, because budgets reveal priorities. And when the state protects equity offices, conference circuits, activist research grants, and cultural programming while basic services are under pressure, taxpayers are allowed to ask whether the government has forgotten what it was hired to do. Fix the roads, protect the public, run essential services, spend money transparently, and stop treating taxpayers like an endless ATM for whatever ideological project happens to be fashionable this year. Because if Oregon can afford creative resistance, it can afford basic accountability. And if it cannot afford both, then maybe the resistance should start with the taxpayers. Thank you for watching Left Coast News. Please like, share, and follow us if you got anything out of this story. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Brady-on, BitChute, Patreon, Facebook, X, Truth Social, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify, and others. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Is this legitimate public health spending or another example of government protecting ideology while cutting core services?